Hello, everyone. How are you doing? So, this episode, I want to talk about The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Jordan Peterson on his reading list has got 5 Dostoevsky books. I'm going to try and get through all of them. But The Idiot is a masterpiece. I think they all are masterpieces. I didn't get a whole lot out of Notes from Underground, which is a shame because it's a short book. It didn't take me very long to read. But the other 4, I had never even heard of heard of Dostoevsky before starting this reading list, and he has become, I think, my absolute favorite author. This is a very interesting book. The way that Dostoevsky wrote this book, and I could kind of tell that he was doing this as I was reading it, and then after I read the book, I read some background on it. And apparently, according to history, this book was written at a very hard time in Dostoevsky's life. He was in debt. He was married to Anna, forget her last name, and they were basically on the run from their debtors, and he needed to make money desperately, but he had a really bad gambling addiction, and they kept getting evicted because they wouldn't pay rent, and so they were just in desperate straits. I don't know how his wife put up with him. She seems to be an amazing person, just from the little that I've read of her. Amazingly patient and loving to her crazy husband. And so he wrote this book during that time, sort of out of desperation, and he had wanted to write a book like this for a long time, but he did not think that he had the artistic ability to pull it off. And so what this idea was that he was so taken with that he wanted to try was to depict on the page a pure, good human being. Like the word that describes Prince Myshkin, I think that's how you say it, the main character, is good. He is a good man, and there's no guile or deceit. He is compassionate and full of pure Christian love towards everyone around him. And you can see why that is such an intimidating idea as an author to depict, because what if you get it wrong? Then your idea of goodness is laid bare for criticism and shambles, and it's a scary idea. And you can tell that as he's writing this, there's a lot at stake, and it's just brilliant. So Myshkin he's a prince, I guess, which is kind of not really important to the novel. And I don't really know what that title meant back then in that time period in Russia, but he's got some impressive family ties, basically, but that doesn't really matter in the novel. He's been living in Switzerland for years at a treatment facility for epileptics. He suffers from epileptic fits, which is a biographical element in the novel because Dostoevsky also suffered from epileptic fits, which is really quite fascinating. I'd never really read much about people that suffered from seizures, but Dostoevsky, also at the time that he was writing this book, his wife became pregnant, and when she went into labor, he suffered an epileptic fit, which was just a horrifying experience for everyone involved because his wife needs help because I'm about to have this baby, and then he's flopping around on the floor like a fish and loses consciousness, and the baby doesn't end up surviving. It survives the initial birth, but then I think it dies about 3 months later, and Dostoevsky blamed himself for that. He's just a very tortured man, I think, and a lot of times the most tortured people make the most brilliant artists. So Myshkin, he comes to Russia. I can't remember if it's Moscow or Petersburg, but at the beginning of the book, he's on a train coming back to Russia from Switzerland, and he has a few connections for family that he's never met before. So he's just kind of going on blind faith, hoping to connect with one of his contacts that he's never met before. And we'll see what happens from there. He doesn't really have a whole lot of skills that could promise employment. So anyway, that's kind of how the book starts. And he is a character, really, all of the the talks that Jordan Peterson would give about the importance of telling the truth and how you can actually feel it in your physiology when you say things, as he says, that make you weak. And so he talked in one of his biblical lectures about how at one point in his life his consciousness sort of separated so that he was watching himself go about his day and act. And he was kind of a mouthy kid, and he would pick sort of intellectual sparring matches with people and arguments so that he could sound smart, basically, in art. He was very good at arguing and even putting people down, not, in a malicious way, but kind of in a way jockeying for his position in the social hierarchy. And but he was watching himself do this just like he had always done. Like he liked to be right, and he liked to win. He liked to be seen as the smart person. But as he was watching himself do this, the part of his consciousness that was watching himself do this was honest and in tune with his truth. And so he would go and say something, but then he would watch himself say it and say, "You don't really believe that. You're just saying that to get attention. You're just saying that to seem smart." And he said it was a very shocking experience for him. And so he decided to not say things that weren't true. He decided to listen to the critical part of his consciousness. And eventually he had to just stop saying anything at all for a really long time. Like 90% of the things he was saying were false, or as he would say, dead wood. And so he got to the point where he could feel this alignment. He describes it as this alignment that when he would speak the truth, and maybe there's some, truth is subjective, or it's not true to there's, I do believe in absolute truth. I'm a Christian. And as far as that goes, I believe in absolute truth. But ever since Jordan Peterson gave that lecture, it really struck me. And I haven't been successful in always telling the truth, but I've been successful in recognizing that feeling. And it is, especially being married, you're constantly, I wouldn't say getting into arguments, but having conversations where your social hierarchy with your spouse is at stake. And it's hard to tell the truth because you might be vulnerable if you do that. But Myshkin, the main character of this book, is someone who does that. and he's not necessarily like a super masculine like truth teller. He's very compassionate, very gentle, but he just has absolutely no social ego, and he says his truth. And it's not the sense that he's like, um, I'm just gonna say what I think, like a Donald Trump kind of person. But he never lies, and he never says anything with an ulterior motive. It's always just pure honesty and sincerity, oriented in a direction of love. So he's a very loving character, and he genuinely wants the good for people, and he loves people, and but he's also not afraid. He's in a sense he's kind of a hero, even though he's sort of an ineffectual, um, sickly sort of character. You know, it describes his face. He looks like someone who's ill all the time because he has this condition. Um, and there's this scene right at the beginning of the book where he goes into the house of one of these people that he wanted to connect with in Russia. And there's three daughters. And he sits down with all the daughters and their mother. And the daughters are really taken aback by his manner of speaking because he's so sincere and honest, and he says what he truly believes in a way that people don't ever talk like that. And all the women just don't really know what to think of him, but they're intrigued. And so they just keep asking him questions, or, say more about that. And he will say things that you can tell are just deeply personal, but they're not to him. Like it's like if you had something that you thought about a lot, but you never told anybody, and they were their themes about like deep things that people don't really talk to unless they know the person really well, or it's like in a church service or or a funeral or the right occasion for it. But he's talking about these things freely and unhindered. His speech is absolutely unhindered. He does not care if he looks silly. And the girls are giggling a lot and sort of whispering to themselves, and they're like, he must be an idiot. So that's why this is called The Idiot, is because at one point or another, all of the characters call him that. But then they realize, no, he's actually not an idiot. He's actually very insightful, and sincere, but he's different. And one character even calls him the Russian word for a holy fool, which is a recurring character in all of Dostoevsky's novels. Is the character of the holy fool. Anyway, really, really daring for Dostoevsky to write a novel like this, because normally you have a character who has an arc and starts. Maybe Myshkin would be the end goal, becoming more honest, becoming more sincere, throwing off the attitude that you have of saying things to impress people or that sort of thing. But Dostoevsky starts with this character, and he even said in one of his letters to somebody, is my intention with this book was to portray a truly good and beautiful soul. And I read a lot of reviews on Goodreads who really didn't like the character. And a lot of the people that I read, and maybe I got this wrong, but it seemed like a lot of people who didn't like Myshkin were women. But then a lot of them who really loved Myshkin were also women. So maybe women just read books more often than men. But I really like the character. I think I believe in Dostoevsky's idea. I stand by it. And a lot of critics were like, it's too gutsy, to write a book like this, and he didn't succeed. And the other thing he did was this was his central idea to see, can I pull this off? Can I really truly represent a beautiful, uncorrupted human soul? And so what he did was he had this character, and then he threw him into a series of scandalous situations. And so this book is kind of episodic. It's like one scandalous episode after another. In I've never read, I'm sure there's a word that I'm looking for. But it's like, there's this respectable society, sort of like any Jane Austen novel would have. You go into the drawing room, and you've got all these respectable aristocratic characters, and then you've got these fiery, scandalous characters thrown in the mix that sort of whip up this circumstance that is just absolutely scandalous. Like, that's the word for it. And let's put Myshkin in the middle of this and see what happens. See if he can hold up in this sort of Dionysian, diabolical situation where everyone is just vying for social status, vying for the destruction or embarrassment of other people in the room. And it's just crazy. And it's like a dinner, like a really screwed up family dinner. Like, where you're just like, why did I even go home for Thanksgiving? That was horrible. And then you go home and cry and like drink for 3 days afterwards because it was so stressful to see your, crazy uncle. Is like those kind of situations. Let's put Myshkin in the middle of this and see what happens. And so Dostoevsky didn't know what would happen when he was writing this book. And you can tell. And a lot of times authors will claim that they do that. Like, I remember reading about Quentin Tarantino scenes where he would create all these colorful characters and then put them in a room and watch what would happen on the page. And maybe Quentin Tarantino could pull this off because he's a talented writer. But I don't buy that when I hear most authors say, just see what happens. Because, it takes an awful lot of insight into human psychology and behavior. And knowing your characters like they're closer than family members to actually pull that off. Because, and I think I have a really good example of this, is people know when you've written badly. Because if you set up a scene, there is an internal logic of how it could, maybe there's, 20 different ways it could play out, but that still leaves 10 million where which it's unrealistic. And so if you betray that internal logic that you've set up with the characters in that scene, people know and they get mad. And a good example of that is the last season of Game of Thrones, because they created these situations and these characters that the fans of Game of Thrones were so familiar with and connected with, and they knew the characters. They were good fans. And then you have that final episode where it's like they created this machine, and then they set it in motion running, and then they had to figure out, how are we going to end this? So they took a gun and shot the machine a whole bunch of times until oil is spurting out of the gasket and sparks are flying. And then they're like, oh, what do we do? And they reach in there. Oh! So they get a glove on and they reach in there and they're like, oh, Bram, he's going to be king, the king of Game of Thrones. And everybody's like, what? Where the heck did that come from? It's totally a rejection of the logic of this system that they've done. And it's really hard to not do that. And I think Dostoevsky succeeded. And the fact that I think he succeeded is because I know what he wanted to have happen. And the end of this book, I was super upset when this book ended, because it's almost, it can be interpreted, the ending can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. But when I read it, I was really sad, because my gut interpretation was that Myshkin's love failed to affect the characters around him. Like, it didn't work. And obviously Dostoevsky did not want that, because he was so attached to this character, and he wanted to prove that this Christian love was he wanted to put that forward as a way to live. This is the ideal human being. This is the way to be. But it didn't work. So he's like, I'm going to test out this idea, throw him into these scandalous situations with these really tough characters, really vicious, fierce characters, and they ended up doing what they were going to do anyway. And maybe I'm interpreting it wrong, because Myshkin definitely did affect a lot of characters, but the way the book ends is it ends in tragedy. But it still made sense. It's still like, yeah, that's what would have happened. So I was very sad when I finished this book, and I didn't like it. I didn't like this book for a few months after I read it. I was upset and affected by it, because I really liked Myshkin, and I liked the other characters too, but they were broken characters, and yeah, and they ended up doing what they were going to do anyway. But it was sort of, a lot of people will just jump to literary allusions, and so maybe I'll go ahead and do that. So I think Myshkin sort of represents a Christ figure, and I guess the end sort of reminded me of maybe what it would have been like to be part of Jesus's, be a witness to what happened in the story of the Gospels. And at the crucifixion, if you were there, it's like we lost, if you were a follower of Jesus. And for those 3 days before he rose from the dead, it's like, as Christians, people, I don't think they really get that. Maybe the Orthodox do, because they have this liturgy where they will act out the passion, and then they will bury Christ, and then 3 days later they'll rise him from the dead. Maybe I have that wrong, but I think there's a sort of theatrical liturgical practice where they will act out the passion. And the books by Cousin Zakis talks about this a lot, and they do a really good job of getting you in the mindset of the Orthodox believers, and they will literally mourn the death of Christ every year. And it's like, yes, that's what it was like. Darkness fell across the land when Jesus died, and the disciples were wrecked. And that's kind of what it's like at the end of this book, is like, it's sort of a failure in a sense. But the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about what happens before that, and Myshkin's love that he radiates to these other characters, it does change them. And you can see this. So there's this character, one of the greatest characters. I really like Myshkin, and I really like this character, Nastasia Philipovna. I love these Russian names. She's probably the other main character. There's like four. So there's Myshkin, Nastasia, Rogozin, and Aglia. And they keep forming these love triangles, which it's like, when you hear that, you're like, oh my gosh, this is like a teen novel of just all these like soap opera love triangles. But it's not that at all. It's like, love is a word that has been misused to death. And so when you say it, it's like almost embarrassing to use that word, because it's just so like, you just want to roll your eyes. Oh, we're talking about love, really? But this is a book about love, and love is a real thing that humans experience, and it's not like Myshkin is this character who's just sort of this representation of Jesus, like kind of a detached sort of observer of all of these poor humans around him and all these poor sinners, and he's going to save them. He like actually participates in their lives as a real man, and he ends up falling in love and experiencing that human emotion. So he's not just this like he's not like up on this high horse because he's so he speaks with unaffected speech. He has no social egoism, but he's still a real human being and experiences these things that human beings experience. And so Nastasia Philipovna is, so her background is that when she was 16, she's an orphan, and her guardian kind of groomed her as a sexual partner. It's very twisted. And so for 4 years, she was kind of just like this concubine for her guardian. And she's much older now, and is kind of a scorned woman. Society views her as a fallen woman because they know what happened. They know that backstory, and she takes on that identity as the fallen woman, because that's how everybody else views her. And so she responds to that by being unbelievably fearful. It's like, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And so you don't mess with Nastasia. She is fierce and just won't let anyone touch her. Basically, there's a couple scenes where the way she treats these men characters is just like I was scared of her because she's engaged to be married to this one guy, sort of as an arranged marriage for her guardian to, okay, if I can just get her married, then maybe this past thing that I did to her will go away. And the guy who she's engaged to wants to marry her basically for the dowry, and he's aware that's shameful, and he's very scared of being looked down upon. He's very cares what people think, and so he's got all this internal conflict and angst, and he ends up blowing up on Myshkin a lot just because he's like, he's so torn between this money and then this social status. And there's this one point at which he's trying to act like he's above it all, and Nastasia just laughs in his face, and it's so savage. It's just the way that she does that. There's another point at which all of these characters, probably like 10 or 15 characters, are sitting around talking. And she turns to Myshkin and says, "Do you think I should marry that guy over there?" And it puts him on the spot, and everyone is just like, "Are we having this conversation?" It's just like totally inappropriate. And the guy that she's engaged to is just so embarrassed and angry and but he's like powerless to do anything about it. And she's doing this to just, this is her way of lashing out back at society for the way that they viewed her. She's kind of viewed as like the woman at the well, sort of like she's a fallen woman, and she takes on this identity, this outward identity of this fallen woman, but she's not going to take crap from anybody else. There's another scene where she has like 100,000 rubles in her hand that another character offered her to marry her, and she like waves it in front of Ganya, the guy who she's engaged to, who wants to marry her for her money, and she's like, "Here's a bunch of money. You want it? You want it?" And she throws it in the fire. Says, "Go get it." And she's a savage, man. But Myshkin looks at her, and he sees a wounded woman who was sinned against through no fault of her own, and she is very drawn to that. Although when she's in social situations, she's got this cynical, tough outward appearance. He sees to the inside, and so she tries to keep this appearance up. But there's this one scene that is so powerful where she's kind of insulting people and acting tough, acting like she doesn't care, after something really horrible has happened. And Myshkin looks at her and he says, "Aren't you ashamed? You can't possibly be the person that you're pretending to be." And he says that to her, and she basically, like, all the walls fall down, and she starts crying, and she goes up to one of the ladies and whispers to her, he's right. And it's so, it's such a powerful scene where he basically talks to the true her past all of the facade, and it works. But then she reverts back. And this is constantly happening throughout the... Oh, hang on a second. This is constantly happening throughout the book. All of these other characters, they're broken in the Christian sense. Their ideas of love are twisted in a sense. There's a character, Rogozin, who is in love with Nastasia Philipovna, but it's not a pure love. It's not agape. It's erotic and violent, passionate love. And so there's like violent danger involved with this character, and lots of other characters. Myshkin has an effect on them. And there's a nihilistic character, a suicidal character, a sort of a teenage girl who's, very emotional and insecure. All of these characters that are drawn to Myshkin's sincerity and his innate goodness, and he does affect them. And you see scenes like the one that I just talked about with Nastasia Philipovna, where the character is going on doing all the stuff that they normally would do, and then Myshkin speaks to them sort of as this voice, like Jordan Peterson was talking about, being like, "That's not who you are. Who you are that's not the real you." And it gets to them, but then they always go back. And that's why I was so upset with this novel, was because what I wanted was the characters to be like, you're right, and because of my encounter with you, I am forever changed. I am a new creation. Um, like it's supposed to be when you become a Christian. Um, but that doesn't happen in this book. It happens with maybe a few characters. They're kind of small characters, but I guess one could argue that their personality was sort of more predisposed to be oriented toward goodness, I guess you could say. So maybe they didn't really change. They just were like, oh yeah, you're right. I am like that. I was just putting on this face for the crowd or something. Um, but the reason why it didn't work, and maybe it did work, it's so hard to say because this is a complicated novel and it's so real, and the people's lives in this story continue on. We are complicated creatures, and we can all look back on parts of our lives years down the road and say, "Oh yeah, that changed me a little bit in this way," and then maybe a few years after that, that encounter with that person changed the way I think in this way, and everything is sort of leading up to who you are today. And ideally, that journey through life is a constant redemption story. That's the Christian story. Um, but this book ends in tragedy, and the effect that Myshkin has on these people doesn't come to fruition, I guess, as a way of saying it, at the end of the book. But I think that that's proof that Dostoevsky was a true, honest artist in the experiment that he did with this book to, let's throw this character in this scandalous scene and then see where it goes. He didn't manipulate. He didn't abandon logos, I guess you could say. He didn't impose his own will into the creative process. He let it take its true path. And the true path is not the one that I wanted or that he wanted. But now that I see that, I have a much greater appreciation for this novel because it's so it's pure art. It's not corrupted by an agenda. Amazing book. I really did not like it after I read it, but now I think that I've come to that conclusion. It's one of my favorites, and it is unbelievably touching. It's very sad, but I do see it now, I guess, not as a failure. Not that Myshkin failed. The redemption throughout this book, or at least the possibility of redemption, I think outweighs the tragedy in the end. So let me know what you think of this book. I definitely wasn't as articulate this episode, and that's just because this book is a hard one for me to figure out, and I tried to come up with an outline for what I was going to say, and I totally went off script. So maybe I was doing what Dostoyevsky was doing in making this episode. But anyway, let me know what you thought of the book if you read it. If not, I highly encourage you to read it. I think it's one of the more profound books that I've ever read. I love Dostoevsky. He's man, there's nobody like him. And I think this isn't even my favorite book of his. But it's so profound. So, okay, I've talked long enough. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.